In the winter of 1855, the residents of Rochester's East Avenue would cross to the opposite side of the street when passing the Eldridge mansion. They spoke in hushed whispers about the sounds that escaped through the heavy oak doors every midnight, sounds that resembled human screams, desperate and agonizing, echoing from within the grand estate. What they didn't know was that those screams came from a portrait hanging in the main hall, a family painting that had been commissioned just months before the mysterious disappearance of half the Eldridge bloodline. Before we dive deeper into the chilling mystery of the Eldridge family and their cursed portrait, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button if you're enjoying these dark tales, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. We love connecting with our international audience who shares our passion for these haunting stories. Your support helps us continue bringing you the most spine-chilling mysteries from America's dark past. Now let's step back into the shadows of 1855 Rochester, where whispered rumors and fragmented accounts passed down through generations would eventually reveal one of the most disturbing family secrets ever documented in western New York. Rochester in 1855 stood as a thriving industrial city along the Genesee River, its flour mills and manufacturing plants drawing wealthy families from across the eastern United States. Among the grand mansions that lined East Avenue, none commanded more respect or later more fear than the Eldridge estate. Built in 1842 by the patriarch Jonathan Eldridge, the three-story Georgian mansion boasted 32 rooms, imported marble from Italy, and grounds that stretched over 4 acres of meticulously maintained gardens. The Eldridge family had built their fortune through grain speculation and railroad investments during the canal boom years. Jonathan, a stern man in his 50s with graying temples and calculating grey eyes, had inherited the family business from his father, but shared ownership with his 3 younger brothers, Samuel, Thomas, and William. Their sister Margaret had married into Rochester's prominent Warner family, while cousins Robert and Charles Eldridge maintained smaller stakes in the family enterprises from their homes in nearby Canandaigua. The mansion itself reflected Jonathan's obsession with control and perfection. The main hall featured a grand staircase of polished mahogany, while the parlor and dining room showcased the finest furnishings money could procure. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, trained never to speak unless spoken to, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian carpets that Jonathan had personally selected during a business trip to New York City. Jonathan's wife, Eleanor, had died giving birth to their only child, a daughter named Catherine, in 1840. The loss had changed Jonathan profoundly, according to neighbors who remembered him before the tragedy. Where once he had been merely shrewd in business, he became ruthlessly calculating. Where he had been protective of family interests, he grew possessive to an alarming degree. Catherine, now 15 in 1855, rarely left the mansion grounds and was educated by private tutors under her father's watchful supervision. The winter of 1854 had brought tensions within the Eldridge family to a breaking point. Jonathan's brothers had begun questioning his management of their shared investments, particularly his decision to purchase additional railroad stocks without consulting the family council. Samuel, the most vocal of the brothers, had threatened to force a dissolution of their partnership unless Jonathan agreed to a more equitable distribution of profits and decision-making authority. On the evening of February 14, 1855, Jonathan announced to Rochester society that he would be commissioning a family portrait to celebrate the Eldridge legacy. He had hired Cornelius Blackwood, a portraitist who had recently arrived from Albany with impressive credentials and a reputation for capturing not just physical likeness, but the very essence of his subject's characters. Blackwood, a thin man in his 30s with intense dark eyes and an unkempt beard, set up his studio in the mansion's East Wing library. Jonathan had requested that the portrait include all the primary stakeholders in the family business: himself, his brothers Samuel, Thomas, and William, his sister Margaret, and their cousins Robert and Charles. Catherine would be positioned at the center, representing the future of the Eldridge name. The first sitting took place on February 20th, a bitterly cold Tuesday, when snow fell steadily outside the mansion's tall windows. According to the household staff, who would later provide testimony to investigators, the family members seemed unusually tense during the session. Samuel and Thomas exchanged sharp words with Jonathan about recent business decisions, while Margaret appeared uncomfortable with the formal arrangement her brother had insisted upon for the portrait. Blackwood worked methodically, making detailed sketches and color notes in a leather-bound journal that never left his side. He had brought his own pigments and brushes, explaining to Jonathan that he preferred to mix his own colors to achieve the precise tones that would bring the portrait to life. The artist had requested a week between sittings to prepare his canvas and begin the preliminary work. It was during this interval that the first disappearance occurred. Samuel Eldridge, who had been staying at the mansion while his own home underwent renovations, simply vanished on the night of February 24th. His bed had not been slept in, his clothes remained in his wardrobe, and his horse stood undisturbed in the stable. Jonathan reported his brother's disappearance to the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, suggesting that Samuel had likely left town suddenly due to business pressures and family disputes. Sheriff William Morrison, a practical man who had known the Eldridge family for years, found Jonathan's explanation plausible given the recent tensions. Samuel had often threatened to leave Rochester entirely if he couldn't reach an agreement with his brothers about the family business. Morrison filed a missing person report, but devoted little manpower to an active search, assuming Samuel would eventually contact the family once he had settled wherever he had chosen to relocate. The second sitting was scheduled for March 3rd, but when the remaining family members arrived at the mansion, they learned that Thomas Eldridge had also disappeared. His absence was discovered the morning of the sitting when he failed to appear for breakfast at his own residence on South Avenue. Like Samuel before him, Thomas had left no note, taken no luggage, and made no arrangements for his departure. Margaret Warner arrived at the mansion in a state of visible distress, questioning Jonathan about the coincidence of two brothers vanishing within a week of each other. Jonathan maintained his composure, suggesting that Thomas had likely followed Samuel's example and left Rochester to avoid the continuing family conflicts. He insisted that the portrait session proceed as planned, arguing that the family needed symbols of unity during these troubled times. Blackwood appeared uneasy as he worked that day, frequently glancing toward the mansion's windows and asking questions about the missing brothers. He had prepared preliminary sketches that included Samuel and Thomas, and he seemed reluctant to continue without them present. Jonathan, however, insisted that the artist proceed, stating that his brothers would return eventually and could be added to the finished portrait at that time. During this session, Margaret noticed something peculiar about Blackwood's pigments. The artist was mixing an unusual reddish-brown color that seemed too dark and rich for any natural earth tone. When she inquired about it, Blackwood became evasive, mumbling something about achieving authentic flesh tones and quickly moving to shield his palette from view. Margaret would later tell investigators that the color reminded her of dried blood, though she dismissed the thought at the time as merely her imagination influenced by worry over her missing brothers. The third disappearance occurred on March 10th, just 2 days before the next scheduled sitting. William Eldridge, the youngest of the brothers at 38, failed to appear at his office at the Eldridge and Associates grain exchange. His clerk found the office locked and William's personal effects undisturbed, as if he had simply stepped away and never returned. By now, even Sheriff Morrison was beginning to suspect that something more sinister than voluntary departures might be occurring within the Eldridge family. Jonathan's explanation for William's absence followed the same pattern as before: family stress, business pressures, and a desire to start fresh elsewhere. However, Morrison noted that Jonathan seemed remarkably calm for a man whose 3 brothers had vanished without a trace within a month. The sheriff began making discreet inquiries among Rochester's business community about the Eldridge family dynamics and recent financial dealings. As March progressed, the portrait sessions continued with only Jonathan, Margaret, Robert, Charles, and young Catherine present. Blackwood had grown increasingly agitated with each sitting, often stopping work to step outside for fresh air or to walk the mansion's halls alone. He complained of headaches and difficulty sleeping, attributing his condition to the stress of working under such unusual circumstances. Margaret Warner had begun her own investigation into her brother's disappearances, visiting their homes and questioning their business associates. She discovered that Samuel had been planning to confront Jonathan about irregularities in the family's financial records, specifically large withdrawals from their shared accounts that had no corresponding business documentation. Thomas had apparently been gathering evidence to support Samuel's allegations, while William had been secretly consulting with attorneys about dissolving the family partnership. On March 18th, Margaret arrived at the mansion unannounced and discovered Blackwood in the library, staring at his work in progress with what she later described as an expression of horror. The portrait had taken on an unsettling quality. The faces of the missing brothers appeared somehow tortured, their eyes holding an anguish that seemed to follow the viewer around the room. More disturbing still, Blackwood had painted their mouths slightly open, as if they were crying out in pain. When Margaret questioned the artist about his unusual artistic choices, Blackwood broke down completely. He confessed that Jonathan had been providing him with special pigments that supposedly carried deep symbolic meaning for the family. Blackwood had been mixing these substances with his paints without questioning their origin, but he had begun to suspect that something was terribly wrong. The pigments had an organic quality that troubled him, and they seemed to react strangely to changes in temperature and humidity. That same evening, Margaret confronted her brother directly about the disappearances and the disturbing nature of the portrait. Jonathan's response was chilling in its calm calculation. He explained that he had indeed discovered his brother's plans to dissolve the family business and seize control of assets he had spent years building. Unable to allow such betrayal, he had taken steps to ensure that the Eldridge legacy would remain intact and under his sole control. The truth that Jonathan revealed to Margaret that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. Each of his brothers had been lured to the mansion under various pretenses: business meetings, family discussions, urgent matters requiring immediate attention. Jonathan had prepared carefully for each encounter, using his knowledge of the mansion's layout and his brother's trust in him to ensure they would be isolated and vulnerable when he struck. Samuel had been the first to die, killed in the mansion's wine cellar during what he believed was a private conversation about family finances. Jonathan had struck him with a wine bottle before strangling him with a length of rope. Thomas had met his end in the conservatory, where Jonathan had arranged a supposed reconciliation meeting. William's death had occurred in the library itself, where he had come to examine some business documents that Jonathan claimed would resolve their disputes. But Jonathan's confession went beyond mere murder. He revealed that he had preserved portions of his brother's blood, collecting it in glass vials that he stored in a hidden compartment behind his desk. This blood had been his special pigment, mixed with Blackwood's paints, to ensure that his brothers would remain forever part of the family portrait, bound to the Eldridge legacy, even in death. The bodies themselves had been concealed within the mansion's walls, hidden in spaces that Jonathan had prepared during recent renovations to the building. He had carefully planned these hiding places, using his knowledge of the mansion's construction to create sealed chambers where the remains would never be discovered. The house itself had become a tomb for the Eldridge brothers, their bodies walled up like victims of some medieval horror. Margaret found herself trapped in a nightmare of family loyalty and mortal terror. Jonathan made clear that she could join her brothers in their eternal rest within the mansion's walls, or she could remain silent and continue to benefit from the family wealth that was now entirely under his control. To ensure her compliance, he revealed that her own daughter, staying at the mansion for the portrait sessions, would serve as additional motivation for Margaret's cooperation. Just when we think we've heard the worst of human depravity, the horror in Eldridge Mansion was about to reach new depths. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries from American history. Give it a like to support our exploration of these forgotten horrors, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more stories like this. Let's discover together how much darker this tale can become. Cornelius Blackwood's discovery of the truth behind his pigments came not through confession, but through his own growing suspicions and a horrifying accident. On March 22nd, while working alone in the library, he knocked over one of his paint containers, spilling the blood-mixed pigment across his wooden pallet. As he attempted to clean the mess, the liquid began to emit a foul odor that reminded him unmistakably of decomposing flesh. Driven by a terrible certainty, Blackwood began to investigate the mansion itself, using his artist's eye to notice inconsistencies in the walls and recent construction work. He discovered that several walls showed signs of recent plastering, with mortar that was a different color and texture than the original construction. More disturbing still, he began to detect a subtle but persistent odor emanating from these areas. An organic smell that grew stronger during warm afternoons when the sun heated the mansion's walls. The artist's investigation led him to understand that the Eldridge mansion had become a charnel house, with the bodies of Jonathan's brothers sealed within its very structure. The special pigments Jonathan had provided were literally the blood of murder victims, making Blackwood an unwitting accomplice in preserving the evidence of these crimes within the portrait itself. Blackwood realized that he was likely intended to be Jonathan's next victim, as the only person outside the family who knew the truth about the pigments and had witnessed the increasingly suspicious circumstances surrounding the portrait's creation. Rather than flee immediately, the artist made a decision that would ultimately expose Jonathan's crimes. He began working secret details into the portrait itself, hidden symbols and coded information that would reveal the location of the bodies to anyone who knew how to interpret them. Working with desperate speed, Blackwood embedded a map of the mansion's layout within the decorative elements of the portrait's background. The pattern of wallpaper, the arrangement of furniture, and even the positioning of shadows contained precise measurements and directions that would lead investigators to each hidden grave. He used traditional artistic techniques to conceal these clues, ensuring that they would only be visible to someone specifically looking for hidden information. On the night of March 25th, Jonathan discovered Blackwood's secret work when he found the artist in the library after midnight, frantically adding final details to his hidden map. The confrontation was brief but violent. Jonathan attacked Blackwood with a fireplace poker, delivering a blow that fractured the artist's skull and left him dying on the library floor. But even as he lay bleeding, Blackwood managed to hide his leather journal, containing explicit notes about the portrait's hidden messages, behind a loose brick in the library's fireplace. The discovery of Blackwood's body could not be concealed or explained away like the disappearances of Jonathan's brothers. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the mansion the following morning to find Jonathan's story about a fatal accident wholly unconvincing. The artist's head wounds were clearly the result of deliberate violence, and the blood patterns in the library indicated a struggle that contradicted Jonathan's claims of an accidental fall. Margaret Warner, finally freed from her paralysis of fear by the artist's death, provided Morrison with Blackwood's hidden journal and a full confession of everything her brother had revealed to her. The journal contained detailed notes about the blood-mixed pigments, sketches showing the location of the concealed bodies, and Blackwood's growing horror as he realized the true nature of his commission. Using Blackwood's coded information, Morrison's deputies began the grim work of opening the mansion's walls. They found Samuel Eldridge's remains in a sealed chamber behind the dining room's main wall, Thomas's body concealed within a false partition in the conservatory, and William's corpse hidden beneath the library's floorboards, covered by a layer of concrete that Jonathan had disguised as routine maintenance. The portrait itself became crucial evidence in Jonathan's trial. Chemical analysis of the pigments confirmed the presence of human blood, while Blackwood's hidden map provided irrefutable proof of premeditation and the systematic nature of the murders. The artistic details that the painter had embedded in his work allowed investigators to locate not only the bodies, but also additional evidence that Jonathan had hidden throughout the mansion. Jonathan Eldridge was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to death by hanging. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that his brothers had left Rochester voluntarily and that Blackwood had died in an accident. However, the physical evidence against him was overwhelming, and Margaret's testimony provided clear motive for the family killings. The Eldridge mansion was sold following Jonathan's execution in September 1855. The new owners discovered that removing all traces of the crimes proved impossible. The walls still carried faint odors from the concealed bodies, and the portrait's screaming sounds returned every midnight, possibly caused by settling wood and changing temperatures affecting areas where the bodies had been hidden. But the most chilling legacy of the Eldridge murders was the revelation of how easily a respected businessman had manipulated his family's trust to eliminate potential threats to his control. The case highlighted the vulnerable position of family members in business partnerships, where personal relationships could mask deadly intentions until it was too late for escape. This tragedy reminds us that the darkest evil often wears the most familiar face, hiding behind the trust and intimacy of family bonds. What do you think about this disturbing chapter from Rochester's past? Do you believe all the secrets of the Eldridge mansion have been uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into one of New York's most haunting family mysteries, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker corners of American history. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying stories are often those that really happened.